Two ranch hands pulled their horses short in the middle of the section road and stared. A small prairie cabin was disappearing behind walls of stacked firewood. Split pine, rough rounds. Row after row climbing higher around the house. One rider laughed. "Bram Calder's gone mad." The other narrowed his eyes. "No," he said. "He's building a wood fort." They laughed harder. Behind the rising wall, Bram Calder said nothing. He only adjusted the stack, then listened to the wind moving through it. That silence unsettled them more than any argument could have, because he worked like a man who already knew something they did not. If stories about grit, old frontier wisdom, and hard-earned survival still mean something, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and stay through the end. Because 5 days later, the blizzard came for every house on that road. But 2 springs earlier, no storm had yet asked its question. Ash Creek Station was still the kind of place where men arrived with wagons full of hope and left with less of it each year. The land was open, cheap, and hard. That was enough to draw people west. Bram Calder came with a steady back, a sound axe, and the habit of working until daylight failed. His wife Eliza came with sharper judgment than most men in town and the sense to count flour before promises. Their son, Noah, came at 10 years old with wide eyes and the quiet habit of noticing everything. They claimed a narrow piece of ground where the wind had room to gather speed. The first cabin went up the same way many cabins did. 16 feet long, 10 feet wide. Rough pine walls, thin board siding. A roof pitched enough to shed rain if the season was kind. Chinks packed tight where time allowed, loose where daylight ran out. From a distance, it looked respectable. From inside, it felt like progress. Neighbors rode past and nodded. A standing cabin meant a family had begun. On the frontier, appearance often passed for proof. Bram believed what many good men believed. If a wall stood straight, it was strong enough. If a roof kept rain out, it was good enough. If a man worked harder than the weather would eventually yield. He was not lazy. He was not foolish. He was simply using the same answers everyone else had been handed. And for a little while, that felt like wisdom. Then the first winter arrived and corrected the feeling. It did not kill them. In some ways, that made the lesson sharper. The stove worked well enough if a person stood near it. Iron glowed. Kettle water steamed. Mittens dried on a chair back. A man could warm his hands and believe the house was warm. 3 steps away, the floor stayed mean. 6 steps away, the far wall held a cold that never seemed to leave. Corners gathered frost in the mornings. The bed by the window felt like it belonged to another season. The room was warm. The house was not. Bram fed the stove harder than he had planned. Then harder than that, logs that should have lasted half a day were gone by noon. Kindling vanished. Splits disappeared. The fire ate with confidence, and still the cabin leaked comfort as fast as he could make it. Their woodpile sat 34 steps from the back door across open ground. Bram knew the number because winter teaches a man to count the things that hurt him. By daylight, it was a nuisance. By dark, it became a contest. He would pull the door open. Wind rushed in like it had been waiting. Snow found the cracks. The stove lost its temper in seconds. Bram would lower his shoulder, run bent against the gusts, seize 2 armloads, then fight his way back while the cold used the open doorway behind him. Noah learned to say nothing when the latch lifted at night. Eliza learned to move blankets toward the door before Bram even reached it. Bram learned something slower. A cabin could stand straight, look proper, and still be built wrong for winter. By late January, even Bram could no longer pretend otherwise. That was when Gideon Pike stopped by. Pike was the oldest house builder within 20 miles. A broad-shouldered man gone lean with age, known for speaking only when he had measured enough to be certain. He had raised barns, dug foundations, set chimneys, and buried men who trusted weak roofs too long. He entered without ceremony, as practical men often did in weather that could kill pride. First, he watched the stove draw. Then he opened the draft a finger's width, studied the flame, and closed it again. He pressed one calloused hand against the north wall and held it there. He crouched to inspect the chinks near the floor. He stepped outside, counted the distance to the woodpile with his eyes, then looked back at the cabin the way a surveyor looks at land he does not envy. When he finally spoke, it was plain. "This house can live through cold," he said. "It won't live through wind." Bram said nothing. Pike continued. "A real storm comes. You'll feed that stove until the pile is gone. Then you'll feed it chairs. Then the table. Then prayers." Eliza stopped moving for a moment at the wash basin. Pike pointed with 2 fingers as he gave remedies. "Bank the north side with sod. Move your wood closer. Bigger stove if you can find one. Better skirt around the floor line." Each suggestion was sound. Each suggestion cost money, time, or help. Bram had little of one, less of the second, and none of the third. Pike saw that too. He did not soften the truth for it. Numbers don't bend because a man needs them to. Then he pulled on his gloves and left. Bram stood in the doorway long after the tracks were filling with blown snow. He had been given a sentence, not an argument. That night, after Eliza and Noah had gone quiet, he stepped outside again. The wind had eased, but the cold remained sharp enough to make every board in the cabin complain. Behind him, thin threads of warmth slipped through seams he had once been proud of sealing. Heat he had already paid for was leaving the house in silence. Ahead of him sat the woodpile. 34 steps away. A short walk in summer. A burden in winter. A gamble in storm weather. Bram looked from the pile to the cabin, then back again. Pike had been right. Every symptom of it. The stove was too small. The walls were too light. The pile was too far. But something in the answers still felt crooked. Men kept speaking as if more wood were the cure. More cutting, more hauling, more burning, more effort. Yet each night Bram watched good fuel vanish while the cold returned almost at once. That was not hunger. That was theft. Noah had followed him to the doorway without sound. The boy stood wrapped in a blanket, eyes half awake. "Pa," he asked, "was he right?" Bram kept looking at the dark shape of the woodpile. "He was right about the loss," he said. Then he turned and laid one hand on the cabin wall. "But not yet about the leak." The words were quiet. Even so, something had changed. For the first time, Bram Calder was no longer thinking like a man who needed more fuel. He was thinking like a man who needed to stop the stealing first. The next afternoon, the back door latch split loose where old screws had worried the wood too many times. Bram set tools on a crate and went to mend it while the wind worried the wall beside him. To work with both hands free, he dragged 3 split pine pieces from the pile and leaned them upright against the siding near the latch side of the cabin. Nothing careful. Nothing planned. Just a quick shield to keep the gusts off his fingers. He fixed the latch in 10 minutes. Then he noticed what his hand had found by accident. The section of wall behind those leaning splits felt different. Not warm, not soft, but steadier. He moved his palm to the exposed boards, 2 feet away. The cold there bit sharper, alive with motion. He moved back again behind the pine. Same wall, same weather, different truth. Bram tested it twice more, sliding his hand from bare boards to covered boards and back again. The answer was immediate every time. Cold alone was one thing. Cold with moving air was another. And with that touch, an old memory rose clear as smoke. Years earlier, in a logging camp north of the Judith Basin, he had seen freight men prepare for January blows. They stacked cordwood tight against the windward side of a bunk shack before hauling season began. Not to burn first, to block the crosswind from finding the seams. Those men had cursed little, wasted less, and slept longer than the crews who laughed at them. At the time, Bram thought it was habit. Now he understood it was arithmetic. He stood back from the cabin and looked at the pile again. Wood was fuel, but wood was also mass, barrier, shelter, stored labor. Most men burned it only one way. For the first time, Bram Calder considered using it twice. That evening, after supper, he cleared a space on the table and turned over an empty feed sack. The back was plain enough for planning. He took a stub of charcoal from the stove box and began to draw. Eliza watched in silence. First he marked the cabin square. Then he circled it with thick lines. The north and west faces the sides that took the worst weather would carry the deepest mass. 5.5 feet if he could spare it. Enough to break the hard wind before it ever touched the boards. The south side could be lighter. 4 feet would do more there than 6 feet would on the wrong wall. At the door side, he left a narrow collar, 2.5 feet, no more. Enough protection to cut the gusts, but not so much that a man trapped himself reaching the latch. Then he drew lanes inside the shell. Dry split wood nearest the cabin, where it could be reached fast and kept useful. Green rounds outside, rough bark turned outward to take weather and hold shape longer. Last came 2 slanting channels through the stack itself. Draw chutes. A man inside could pull wood inward without opening the door longer than a breath. Eliza finally spoke. "You mean to build walls out of the winter?" Bram shook his head. "No, I mean to make the winter pay for crossing them." He tapped the charcoal at the inside lanes. "If it burns from here outward, the shell lasts longer." He tapped the outer ring. "And if the shell lasts long enough, we do too." The room fell quiet after that, because the plan made sense, and because it sounded dangerous in exactly the same measure. At first light, Bram carried the first split pine from the old woodpile and set it tight against the north wall of the cabin. Then he carried another, and another. He was not stacking wood the way men stacked wood for storage. There was no loose haste in it. No careless tower meant only to wait for an axe. He sorted each piece by length, heavy rounds low, straighter splits above them. Bark turned outward to take weather. Gaps left small and deliberate, just enough to trap still air, never enough to invite moving wind. Every course leaned inward the width of half a finger, enough that time and weight would tighten the wall instead of pushing it apart. Noah worked beside him, carrying wedges and bark strips in both arms, proud to be useful and trying not to show how cold his hands were. Eliza stood in the doorway with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the way a careful woman watches men make promises with lumber. By noon, the first rise stood near Bram's knee. By mid-afternoon, it reached his thigh. The wind came hard across the open ground and struck the north side as it always had. But inside the cabin, the boards no longer rattled the same way. The wall still felt cold. It no longer felt hunted. 2 riders slowed on the road and reined in to stare. One laughed. The other pointed with a gloved hand. "Look there," he said. "Calder's stacking his fire before he burns it." Both men laughed then. Bram never turned. He set another log in place, checked the angle, and reached for the next one. The first piece had been labor. The second had been hope. By the 100th, it had become a challenge thrown directly at winter. On the 3rd morning, with the north side standing a little over 3 feet high, Mara Hensley rode in and tied her mare to the fence rail. Her teenage son, Eli Hensley, stayed back by the fence, pretending not to watch while watching everything. Mara was the kind of neighbor whose praise was scarce because she wasted none of it. She had buried a husband, kept her own place running, and learned to trust only what kept working after dark. She stepped to the cabin wall without greeting, pulled off one glove, and pressed her palm against the section now covered by Bram's timber shell. Then she crossed 2 strides and pressed the same hand against the exposed boards on the west side. She jerked it back from the bare wall first. The difference was plain enough that no argument could hide it. Mara looked at the stack again, this time longer. Then she began the real test. "Every log you burn," she said, "is 1 more inch of wall gone." She pointed to the corner join. "That pushes outward wrong. Your window breaks before the storm does." Then she looked toward the doorway. "Drift piles high on this side. Wind will turn mean and funnel straight at your latch." Noah stopped moving wood to hear the verdict. Eliza watched Bram instead. He set down the split in his hands, checked the lean of the latest course, and answered without hurry. "Then I'd better build it right." Mara said nothing for several seconds. She put her glove back on, nodded once, and walked to her horse. That was not approval, but it was not laughter either. And on a frontier where foolish plans usually announce themselves early, silence from a woman like Mara Hensley counted as more than kindness. It counted as evidence. But evidence travels slower than mockery. By Saturday, the story had reached Silas Red's mercantile, where flour, lamp oil, nails, gossip, and unpaid accounts were traded under the same roof. Silas stood behind the counter with both thumbs hooked in his suspenders, enjoying himself. "Calder's out there," he told the room, "stacking tomorrow's fire against today's walls." That earned laughter. He waited for it to settle, then added the second blow, building himself a fine little Firewood prison. The room laughed harder at that. Men repeated the phrases because borrowed wit costs nothing. By noon, riders were taking the long way home just to pass Bram's claim and stare at the rising shell around the cabin. Some slowed, some pointed, some offered advice no one had asked for. Children adopted the joke fastest. They galloped past the fence line, shouting, "Wood Fort! Wood Fort!" before racing off again. Bram heard every bit of it. The road lay too close for him not to. He heard Silas's lines repeated in voices that did not know where they came from. He heard laughter drift farther than hammer blows. He heard Noah pretend not to hear any of it. And still, he stacked. One course higher on the north wall. One brace tighter at the corner. One lane clearer for the draw chute. He did not answer the town, because towns can always find more words. He was busy building something that would have to answer for itself. For the moment, ridicule was cheap. Winter had not yet named its price, but the work had. By the second week, the wood fort could be seen from the road without a man needing to squint. The shell around the cabin had shape now. Enough shape that strangers judged it. Enough shape that Bram had to finish it. That was when the easy timber ran out. Everything close to the cabin had already been cut, split, dragged, or stacked. What remained stood deeper, along the creek bend where the ground dipped and held shadow longer. Those trees were heavier, rougher, and farther from mercy. The mule could still pull, but only in short bursts. After 20 yards it stopped, with its head low and sides working hard. Bram no longer cursed it. Old strength is honest when it fades. So he used pry poles, chains, and time. He spent half a day bringing in enough rounds for a single course. Daylight shortened. The ground froze harder each morning, turning every footing slick or uncertain. Logs that should have rolled caught in ruts. Tools slipped. Breath burned the throat. Noah sorted pieces by size with red hands and a brave face. Eliza patched gloves, boiled beans, and kept the stove alive with scraps Bram would rather have saved. Then came the warning he could not ignore. After one night of hard freeze, the northwest corner settled a little out of line. Not failure, not collapse. Just enough movement for a careful man to lose sleep. Bram studied it before dawn, palm on the wood, eyes tracing the lean. The structure still stood, but standing was not the same as being ready. A strong back could haul logs. It could not argue with bad geometry. Near noon, while Bram was studying the shifted corner for the 10th time, a wagon creaked to a stop at the road. The driver climbed down slowly, favoring one knee, and walked over without asking leave. Cyrus Vane had spent half his life building freight platforms, timber braces, and winter camps, where a bad corner could kill men in their sleep. He was old enough to move carefully, and sharp enough to waste no motion. He looked once at the wall, then once at Bram, then back to the corner. "Idea's right," he said. "Geometry's wrong." That was all. He bent, pulled 3 pieces free, asked for a maul, and began rebuilding the corner while Bram and Noah watched. He crossed one layer long, the next short, turned faces, locked ends, left no straight seam running upward where pressure could climb. Then he leaned the new courses slightly inward. "Build straight," Cyrus said, "and time pushes you apart." He dropped another round into place. "Build inward, and time helps. When the weight settled, the corner tightened under its own load. Cyrus struck the side with his palm. The wall answered with a dull, solid note. "Round wood hates square corners," he said. "Always has." He pointed to the upper courses. "Weight can be enemy or helper. Depends who teaches it where to go." Bram said little, but his eyes stayed on the rebuilt join-the-way thirsty men watch water. Because a stranger had just done more than fix a corner. He had confirmed the thing beneath it. The plan itself was not foolish, only unfinished. Cyrus stayed 2 days. He never announced it. He simply unharnessed his team, fed them beside the fence, and began teaching as if the matter had already been decided. He showed Bram how to lean close to the timber shell and listen. Not to the boards, not to the wind outside. To the whistle of air finding a path where no path should be. "If you can hear it," Cyrus said, "it's stealing." They walked the wall together, ears near the seams. Where the sound thinned, Cyrus drove narrow bark wedges into gaps with the handle of a hatchet until the whistle died. He turned every loose face round, so the bark looked outward. "Weather peels flesh faster than hide," he said. "Wood knows the same." At the draw chute, he reshaped Bram's first idea with 3 quick blows and a pry bar. Narrower on the outside, wider within. Then he cut the floor of the chute on a slight slope. Meltwater runs out. Cold air has less reason to stay. Noah followed each lesson as if it were church. He fetched wedges before being asked, tested seams with mittenless fingers, repeated measurements under his breath so he would not lose them. Cyrus approved only once. "Good," he said. That evening, Bram pulled a split log through the chute from inside the cabin. The door stayed latched. The stove kept drawing steady. Hardly any warmth escaped. No one spoke for several seconds, because some truths need silence after them. Then Cyrus pointed toward the corner braces. "Watch corners," he said. "Faces lie, corners confess first." That was frontier schooling. Short lessons, paid for in weather. By the end of the week, the north wall and windward corner had already begun to tell the truth. When hard gusts crossed the open ground, the inside boards no longer shivered the way they once had. Cups on the shelf rattled less. Candle flames held steadier. A man could lay his palm against the north interior planks and feel something strange. The wall was still cold, but it was calm. Cold that moved had become cold that waited. The draw chute proved itself each night. Bram could pull fuel inward, close the hatch, and keep the stove temper steady without throwing the whole cabin open to the dark. A part of the system had already won, but only a part. The door side still stood lower than he had planned. Close timber was gone. What wood remained came slow and costly from the creek bend. The weakest side of the house was the side every storm would search for first. Silas Red rode by that afternoon and slowed enough to call toward the yard. "How fares the wood fort, Calder?" The laugh he expected did not spread as far this time. Gideon Pike was among the riders behind him. He said nothing. His eyes moved from the north mass to the unfinished collar at the doorway, then to the chimney smoke rising straighter than before. A practical man knows when facts have entered a conversation. He simply may not like them yet. After they rode on, Bram stood alone in the yard and looked northwest. The sky there had gone the color of hammered lead, flat, heavy, too quiet for comfort. He placed one hand against the timber shell, feeling the stillness it had made. Then he looked at the low side by the door. The most dangerous condition on the frontier was not failure. It was being almost ready when weather arrived first. The next day the wind died completely. Not softened, not eased, died. Smoke from every chimney in Ash Creek Station rose straight upward like dark cords pulled into a white sky. No drift moved. No loose board tapped. Even dogs barked less, as if sound itself had gone cautious. Cattle turned their backs to the lee side fencing and stood that way for hours. Men who had seen winters before noticed and said little. By sunset, The temperature dropped fast enough to be felt minute by minute. Bram worked until the last light thinned out. He dragged the final usable logs into the low collar beside the door. When the wood ran short, he broke old fence rails and set them into the gaps as bracing. Ugly timber still stops weather. His hands were slow by then. His breath smoked hard. Eliza stepped out with a lantern and watched him fit the last rail into place. The yard was so still that the sound of wood settling seemed loud. She looked at the unfinished sky, then at the wall around her home. "Enough?" she asked. Bram did not answer quickly. He studied the low side once more, then the north mass, then the road already beginning to vanish in dusk. At last he nodded once. Enough to be tested. No bravado, no promise, only the kind of truth a tired man can still afford to speak. Then he took the lantern from her hand, and together they went inside while the prairie held its breath. The blow came before dawn. No warning cry, no gradual rise. One moment there was silence. The next, wind hit the prairie sideways, with the sound of glass breaking across miles of open land. Snow lifted from everywhere at once. Fence lines vanished. The road disappeared. The horizon was erased so completely that earth and sky became the same white violence. The cabin shook hard on the door side. Loose iron on the latch chattered. Something outside tumbled once, then was gone. But the northwest wall took the first strike of the storm the way a breakwater takes surf. The deep timber shell groaned, settled, and held. Inside, Bram was already awake. He checked the stove first. Draft steady, flame clean, no back smoke. Then he crossed to the windward wall and laid his palm against the boards. Cold, yes, but not the sharp, biting cold of moving air. The wall had winter in it. It did not have winter passing through it. Eliza wrapped blankets tighter around Noah and fed the kettle. No one wasted words. In weather like that, speech should earn its place. At first light, though, there was little light to call morning. Bram opened the inner hatch of the draw chute and pulled in 2 dry splits. He shut it again within seconds. The stove never lost its pull. No blast of snow entered. No warmth fled the room in panic. Each hour, Bram repeated the same circuit. Stove, wall, corner braces, chute. Then his hand returned to the north side, feeling for change the way a doctor feels for fever. Outside, the storm threw itself harder. Inside, the cabin did something it had never done before. It kept its strength under attack. And for the first time since winter began, hope had evidence. By the second day, hope needed management. The storm did not weaken. It only changed tactics. Wind shifted half a point south and packed snow deeper against the outer courses. Weight settled the shell lower. Some pieces tightened usefully. Others pinched where Bram needed movement most. One draw chute began to narrow. Not enough to fail. Enough to punish carelessness. Bram worked with a hatchet handle and pry bar, easing one piece, relieving pressure from another, never opening more space than he could afford. A loose wall could kill as surely as a cold room. Noah kept count. Each time Bram brought in wood, the boy scratched a mark into the door frame with a nail point. One armload, then another, then another. Soon the marks mattered more than any clock. Bram rotated the dry splits inward first, where fast flame gave best return. He saved slow-burning pieces for night hours. He pulled heavier green rounds from lower outer rows where the drift now braced the load from outside. Snow, if understood, could become temporary timber. That was frontier arithmetic. Use what arrives. Waste nothing. Beyond their walls, Ash Creek Station was paying a different price. One family had to open their back door again and again to reach fuel. Each trip invited the storm inside. Another household lost the path to its woodpile entirely. Somewhere downroad, men had begun breaking chairs and feeding table legs to a stove built for better plans. Inside Bram's cabin, no one spoke loudly. The marks on the doorframe grew. The shell thinned by degrees. The room stayed livable. Bram understood now that survival was rarely won by strength alone. Most often, it was won by inventory discipline. One careless fire could spend tomorrow. One careful armload could buy the night. By the fourth night, even carefulness was tired. The storm still screamed across the prairie. Snow struck the walls in bursts that sounded like thrown sand. Sleep came in pieces and left quickly. Then came a heavy blow against the east side. Once. Then again. Bram looked up at once. Not wood settling. Not drifts sliding. Too sharp. Too desperate. A third strike came, weaker than the first two. A human sound hidden inside weather. He tied a rope around his waist and looped the other end around the stovepost. Eliza was already there, hands on the knot, before he asked. Noah stood pale and wide-eyed, holding the lantern uselessly against a world no flame could reach. Bram opened the door. The storm entered like an animal. He lowered his shoulder and moved into the white blindness, one hand on the rope, the other searching along the outer wall. If he lost the timber shell, he lost direction. If he lost direction, the rope would be all that remembered him. His glove struck cloth, then a shoulder, then a frozen arm still trying to knock. It was Eli Hensley. The boy had gone looking for his family's shed after their path disappeared. He had drifted too far, lost every landmark, and kept walking until he hit the one solid thing left, standing clear enough to find: the wood fort. Bram dragged him inside by main strength and rope. Eliza had blankets ready before the door was barred. Boots off, gloves cut free, hands rubbed, feet warmed slowly. Small sips first. No rush, no panic. Eli's lips moved before sound came. Couldn't see home, he whispered. No one answered that. They did not need to. That night, Bram fed the stove more wood than any plan had allowed, and he did it gladly. Because the thing men had laughed at all winter had just become a lighthouse made of firewood. On the sixth morning, the sky opened as if none of it had happened. Light spread pale and thin across drifts piled chest-high in places. Fence posts stood like broken teeth from the snow. Whole wood piles around Ash Creek Station had vanished beneath hard-packed white mounds. Paths from back doors to sheds were erased so completely that some men had to guess where they used to walk. From Bram Calder's chimney, smoke still rose in a steady line. Mara Hensley came first. She crossed the yard without hurry, saw Eli alive beside the stove, and closed her eyes once before opening them again. Then she stepped outside to the timber shell that had been mocked for weeks. She laid one hand against it and left it there. No speech, no tears made for witnesses. Only a nod, small and final, from a woman who knew when truth had collected a debt. Gideon Pike arrived later on horseback. He dismounted, circled the structure slowly, and inspected it the way craftsmen speak when they choose silence first. He studied the settlement lines, the corners still locked tight, the low collar guarding the door, the draw chute still clear enough to work. Then he faced Bram. I was right about the cold, he said. Wrong about the answer. For a man like Gideon, that was a larger apology than most speeches. Silas Red came last. He stood in the road beside two others and looked from Bram's chimney smoke to the half-buried remains of his own distant woodpile. No one with him laughed. Silas did not either. But the real victory was not their silence. It came in the weeks that followed, while the snow still lay deep. Ash Creek Station began doing what frontier people only do after weather has taught the lesson hard enough. They copied what worked. Windward walls of cordwood rose beside cabins that once stood bare. Covered lanes appeared between doors and fuel stacks. Wood piles were dragged closer to houses instead of arranged neatly for pride. Rough draw chutes showed up in smaller homes. Corner crib blocks were built by men who had mocked them loudest. Women came to Eliza asking how she kept blankets dry, how few times a door truly needed opening, how to keep warmth from fleeing in a panic. No one called it invention. They called it something simpler. What Bram did. One afternoon, Noah watched men down the road stacking timber around their own walls. Did we beat it? He asked. Bram set one split log into the stove and shook his head. No. He closed the door and listened to the draft take hold. We just learned how to make it work harder. Years later, travelers passing through Ash Creek would notice cabins ringed with wood like low ramparts, sheltered paths running to fuel stacks, and doors placed behind short walls that broke the wind before it entered. If they asked why, old-timers gave plain answers. Don't let distance kill you in a storm. Don't let wind steal what sweat already paid for. And like all true frontier wisdom, it did not live in books first. It lived in the things people kept doing. Do you think Bram's timber fort was genius? Or would you have called it madness before the blizzard?